Let the day perish wherein I was born, and the night in which it was said, there is a man-child conceived. Let that day be darkness. Let not God regard it from above, neither let the light shine upon it. Let darkness and the shadow of death stain it. Let a cloud dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it.
On the 13th of February 1990, the body of Foreign Affairs Minister Robert Ouko was found near his Koru home. His death sparked off a frenzy of activity in Kenya and abroad. In a gesture that must have caught many of his inner circle off guard, President Moi asked a team from New Scotland Yard in London to investigate Ouko's murder. The team was headed by Detective Superintendent John Troon. Troon came up with a theory that something happened, a row of some sort, during President Moi's trip to Washington just 2 weeks before Ouko was killed. This might just have provided a motive for the minister's murder.
There is tenuous evidence, both fact and circumstantial, that some form of dispute or disagreement took place in Washington.
This was a basis for Troon's Washington trip theory. On Saturday, 27 January 1990, President Moi was seen off by Vice President Saitoti from Nairobi to attend what was called a prayer breakfast in Washington, hosted by President George Bush in the presence of 3,800 delegates from around the world, including 3 other heads of state. With Moi was a delegation of 83 ministers and civil servants. It was termed a private trip, not an official state visit, but there would be opportunities for meetings behind the scenes. President Bush met with Moi and 3 other heads of state at the Hilton Hotel at 7:28 on the morning of February 1st. At 9:26, he addressed the assembled delegates for 6 minutes before returning to the White House. Later, President Moi, Bible in hand, addressed the delegates for 30 minutes. The next day, Ouko gave a routine press conference. Then the entire delegation departed for London and on to Nairobi. They arrived on the afternoon of Sunday, February 4th. On Monday the 5th at 9, Dr. Ouko and his permanent secretary, Bethwell Kiplagat, attended a meeting with Moi at State House. The president granted Ouko a few days off before his next official trip to the Gambia. It was due just over a week later on February the 14th. Later that day, Ouko traveled to Kisumu, Nyahera, and ultimately to his farm in Koru, where he was to spend the last week of his life. In his final report, Troon referred to Ouko's pensive and concerned attitude after he returned from Washington. Could the motive for Dr. Ouko's murder lie in a row during the Washington trip? Troon thought so, and he named those he thought might have been involved.
Throughout the inquiry, strong indications have been given of some form of serious dispute between Dr. Ouko and Mr. Biwott during the Washington trip, whilst factual evidence to support this allegation is somewhat tenuous.
Nicholas Biwott was then Kenya's Minister for Energy and had been on the Washington trip. Troon also named the sources for the Washington trip allegation.
The allegations are hearsay and have come mainly from Barack Mbaja and Mrs. Randiak.
Had Troon found a possible motive for Dr. Ouko's murder? A row in Washington over a meeting with President Bush? A press conference? Or embarrassing allegations of corruption? Well, the answer is almost certainly not.
The principal source of the Washington trip theory was Barack Mbaja, Dr. Robert Ouko's brother. But he was not on the Washington trip. He claimed to have heard this story from a Malachi Adenyo, an official at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Nairobi, who in turn was not on the Washington trip. So their testimony would have been hearsay. And anyway, Adenyo denied having told Mbaja of any problem at all on the Washington trip. The other source of the theory was Dorothy Randi, Dr Robert Ouko's sister. She too was not on the Washington trip herself. Her testimony would have been hearsay. She claimed to have heard the story from Bethuel Kiplagat, who was the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Kiplagat denied ever telling her of any problem on the Washington trip.
Troon included Randiak's alleged conversation with Kiplagat in his final report, yet she made no mention of it in any of her written statements. Mbaja claimed the row was over a meeting between Bush and Ouko, but again, Randiak didn't mention a meeting in any of her statements. So, Troon's Washington trip theory rests on the unsupported and contradictory hearsay testimony of just two witnesses. But the story of what supposedly happened in Washington grew with the telling. And again, the principal storyteller was Robert Ouko's brother, Barack Mbaja. In late October 1990, a few days before he was due to give testimony and face cross-examination in front of the public inquiry into the Ouko murder headed by Justice Gisheru, Mbaja fled Kenya and was later granted asylum in the United States. In September 1991, now living in the US, Mbaja signed a sworn affidavit, a written statement made on oath, which was delivered to the inquiry. In it, Mbaja said his brother had phoned him the evening he returned from Washington and told him that he had advised President Moi not to go to Washington because criticism of Kenya's human rights would make the trip unpleasant. That Ouko, President Moi and Biwott rowed over alleged foreign accounts held by Kenyan ministers, and that Dr. Ouko had been sent back on a different flight, his passport seized, security guards and official drivers removed, sacked by President Moi and banished to his Koru farm. So, was it true? Had Dr. Ouko been sacked, banished, and cast out into the wilderness by his president? Well, again, the answer is a pretty emphatic no. Evidence from the time of Dr. Ouko's murder tells a different story altogether, as do some recently revealed secret and confidential telexes between the US Embassy in Nairobi and the State Department in Washington.
Being cold-shouldered. Look, here's another one I strongly...
Martin Mins has extensively researched and written about the Ouko murder case. He came across evidence obtained through the Freedom of Information Act in the United States, previously unpublished secret and confidential telexes between the US State Department and the US Embassy in Nairobi at the time of Dr. Robert Ouko's murder.
Troon's Washington trip theory developed into one in which President Moi was cold-shouldered by the Bush administration and that they did not want him to come to the prayer breakfast visit to Washington. The telexes tell a very different story.
The telexes were made available under the US Freedom of Information Act in 2009. Earlier inquiries into the Ouko murder didn't have access to them. What they reveal was an acute American anxiety over a military access agreement that was due for renewal in June 1990.
They show that the Bush administration was desperate that President Moi's visit to Washington should be a success, and they were bending over backwards to make sure that it was. It is true that Dennis Afande, who was Kenya's ambassador to the United States at the time, advised against President Moi's trip to Washington going ahead. This advice was not given by Ouko, as Mbaja claimed, nor for the reasons Mbaja gave.
At that time, I was also working with particularly the State Department and my own Ministry of Foreign Affairs for a possible visit of our president to the United States on an official visit. So when I learned that this visit was coming, I thought that would not serve my purpose of trying to push for an official visit. So I advised that the visit should not take place. I called then Robert Ouko. It would have been about a day later or the same day. He called me back and said he had seen the president. He's aware of my advice, but the president has said, "We're coming."
Kenya wasn't just important to the Americans. It was their most important security account in Africa.
Kenya is our key security account in Africa. A meeting with Moi will afford our president the opportunity for the president to review our relationship with Kenya and the situation throughout that part of the world. especially in light of this summer's renegotiation for our crucial military access agreement with Kenya.
In the early 1990s, donors were petrified that the instability they saw in places like Rwanda and Burundi was going to be replicated across East Africa. So a big concern there was Kenya's geostrategic importance for regional political stability.
Kenya is a key ally in Africa and an historic friend. We will be entering into some crucial military negotiations later this year. Therefore, it is essential that Moi's visit come off smoothly.
The decision was taken by the Americans not to have a one-to-one meeting between Presidents Bush and Moi, but despite this, and criticism from some US congressmen over human rights, the trip to Washington seemed to go very well, as US diplomatic telexes from this time prove. This is just one example.
Moi seemed pleased with the trip when we saw him onto the Concorde a few hours ago. He was referring to my friend the President and my friend Secretary Baker. There were no glitches, no demonstrations. Washington press was on good behavior, and apparently, Moi had a good reception from members of Congress.
So you can see my happiness. That I was in the end, everything went on well, very, very well. And of course, the functions we had at our residence, it was really moving experience.
Everybody was elated because President had done so well. And when he finished, there was a standing ovation. I was so happy. Everybody clapped and so on because he was eloquent and he was very, very, very deep in his presentation.
Not one member of the Kenyan delegation who was interviewed by Troon, or later by the Kenyan police, said they knew of any disagreement at all involving Dr. Robert Ouko.
To me, I think it was the best trip ever because we didn't have any responsibilities other than to accompany the president and to mill around in his lounge all the time.
I attended some of the meeting. We are meeting with Kenya human, not Kenya here, human rights groups. Biwott is here, Ouko is here.
The famous.
Communicating
yes.
nicely, happy. The last thing that we did was for a press conference. Decided who should give the, naturally, Ouko. The other ministers are here, all of us were there, brilliant.
I called my officers after the visit of the staff in my embassy for a post-mortem and asked them plainly, did you ever hear any ministers or other officials quarreling or disagreeing? And particularly what I'm hearing of Ouko and Biwott disagreeing in a way. And everybody was surprised that there was that issue should be coming up at all.
I never had any row with him. I never had any quarrel with him. We never quarreled with him at all. And I said, our relationship had been very good. He himself also was very good in his work.
I didn't notice anything untoward, even when he came back. To me, at that time, he was just himself. He told me that, as usual, whenever he came back, he would tell me what had happened. And he told me the trip was very successful, as far as he was concerned. He didn't tell me anything strange.
Far from Ouko being out of favor, Dennis Afande says Moi was praising his Minister of Foreign Affairs.
I would be present in those meetings, most of them. And I would see the kind of reaction from President Moi is appreciation, where you will tell Robert Ouko, Jatelo, move on, yes, Jatelo, get on with the work. It's very good, thank you. This, Jatelo means the chairman, something like that. And I knew, when he calls him Jatelo, I knew he was very happy with him. And I used to hear that Jatelo many times.
And there's ample testimony that Robert Ouko and Nicholas Biwott were on friendly terms.
We put Minister Ouko and Minister Biwott in the same vehicle. And they were traveling together. Used to make jokes. There are people who had worked together for a long time, joking with each other all the time, at times when I'm traveling with them.
Yeah, we had a friendship. And in fact, he had employed my daughter, Rhoda, at his ministry, in his ministry. And she worked there for a while until she was married. So we had really good relations with him.
Now, in 26 short years, we have over 40 secondary schools. There wasn't a...
So to the last day in Washington and Dr. Ouko's press conference that, according to Dorothy Randi, in some way came to cause him anxiety.
And also his concerns.
It's difficult to see anything in Ouko's press conference that could have given him or anyone else reasons for concern. This was the Americans' assessment.
Ouko gave a press conference at the Willard on the morning of Moi's departure, which I attended. It was a non-event. Ouko started a rambling monologue of Kenya's population problem and economic development priorities.
Ouko's press conference would neither have offended Moi nor outstaged him, as some people have claimed. And it was played and replayed on Kenyan state-controlled television. That would not have happened without Moi's knowledge.
It cost the U.S. and other countries.
Biwott's allegation was that President Bush had seen Ouko's press conference and then asked to meet him. The press conference took place on the morning of February 2nd, just hours before the Kenyan delegation left Washington. President Bush's official diary chronicled every minute of his working life. It makes no mention of any meeting with Ouko. Ouko's press conference was scheduled to begin at 8 a.m. when President Bush was attending a national security briefing in the White House. At 8:31, he flew by helicopter from the White House to Maryland, where at 8:54 he departed for North Carolina. He did not return to Washington that day.
Dr. Robert Ouko could not and did not meet with President Bush, as Mbaja alleged.
There have been claims that a photograph of Bush meeting with Ouko was taken, but this too is not true. In 2000, Warren French from the Bush Presidential Library was asked to search its files of some 1 million official White House photographs. He wrote,
I could not find any reference to Dr. Ouko. Based on this search, I can state that there is neither an official photo of Dr. Ouko with the president for the dates in question, nor does he appear in the photo database.
In 2013, 23 years after Dr. Ouko's murder, the TJRC concluded,
in addition, the Washington trip theory revolves around a private meeting with President Bush and Ouko that never actually occurred.
They didn't meet at that time at all. Because I knew they had known each other. They did meet a number of times. But at that time, there was no meeting between Minister Ouko and President Bush.
US officials, both at the embassy in Nairobi and in the State Department in Washington, knew a week after Dr. Robert Ouko's body was found that there had been no meeting with President Bush during the Washington trip, and that the rumours of some sort of row over a press conference with Dr. Robert Ouko were untrue.
Everyone has a theory. Two variants on the theory are that A, Ouko upstaged the president in a press conference in Washington, answering questions the president couldn't address, and B, that Ouko had a separate one-on-one with President Bush, leading Moi to conclude that Ouko was a threat and being groomed by the Americans to take his place. We have flatly refuted the premises of these explanations in private conversations, but find that our denials have little effect on our Kenyan interlocutors, who, having made up their minds, are adamant that this must be the truth.
I raised it with Smith Hemston, and I told him I'd like to know whether it is true or not that Robert Ouko met with Bush privately and Bush refused to meet with Moi. And he told me, let me check and I'll come back to you. And he did. And he came back to me and he said he had checked and the State Department Mandarins had assured him that there was no such private meeting that took place.
The Kenyan delegation left Washington on February 2nd, and Dr. Ouko was on that flight. Moses Mahugu was the chief of protocol in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He traveled with the delegation.
Dr. Ouko traveled on Concorde to London with the president and then by Kenya Airways to Nairobi. On arrival at Nairobi, Dr. Ouko seemed his normal self and had traveled in his normal position on the aircraft, which is a double seat next to the president's double seat. Dr. Ouko would be seated next to Mr. Biwott.
Moi landed in Nairobi just after 4 p.m. on Sunday, 4th February, and Dr. Ouko was with him. There are so many photographs in the archives showing Moi and Ouko coming off the plane and greeting the crowds at the airport, supported by multiple witness testimonies, that it seems unbelievable that this fact was ever called into question.
We were together. In London, we were traveling in the same car. In the plane, we came together and up to the airport. And then when we arrived at the airport, we were all scrambling for our luggage.
And Ouko's passport was not seized at the airport as Mbaja had claimed. Ouko's secretary, Rispa Okonji, testified that it was handled with other travel documents by Ouko's personal assistant, Susan Anguka, after his return from Washington in preparation for his visit to the Gambia. And later, Mrs. Ouko handed the same passport over to the British police.
I would wish to state, further to the statement that I have given to Superintendent John Trun, that today, on the request of the CID Nairobi, I have handed over my passport number D0002818 and that of my late husband, passport number D002700.
Nor were Ouko's driver and bodyguard removed from service. His official driver, Joseph Otieno, drove Ouko to Koru and after that week returned to Loresho to pick up Mrs. Ouko and return her the day before he was murdered. His bodyguard Gordon Undu also traveled with Dr. Ouko. He carried out tasks for him during the week and was waiting for him in Kisumu as instructed on the morning of February 13th. And Dr. Ouko maintained telephone contact with his permanent secretary, Bethel Kiplagat, and his personal assistant, Susan Anguka, throughout the last week of his life. The alert that Dr. Ouko was missing was only finally raised by officials in his ministry when Ouko failed to turn up to Nairobi Airport to travel to the Gambia. President Moi had been due to make an official visit to the Gambia, but at the last minute he asked Ouko to take his place. So he gave Ouko a few days off at home before he left. That is the level of confidence Moi had in his minister just after the Washington trip. In the last weekend of his life, Dr. Robert Ouko was here at the Imperial Hotel in Kisumu. He'd been invited by the Rotary Club to deliver a speech in which he recalled the hugely successful trip to Washington. In footage that has never been broadcast before, this is Robert Ouko's last public address.
And you feel proud to walk around the world as a Kenyan, particularly when you're the Kenyan in charge of foreign affairs. You feel happy. Kenya's name is good. It is good because of President Moi's efforts here and overseas. I was privileged to be with him in New York last week, in Washington. And I can tell you, the Americans were a bit surprised, pleasantly surprised. The president is a Christian, so he got hold of the Bible and he preached for half an hour. At the end of it, almost all the 3,000 people wanted to come and shake hands with him because he said, if you ever come to Kenya, don't hesitate to call me. And Americans lined up to take his telephone number. And I want to tell you that our beloved President, His Excellency Daniel Arap Moi, has done to Kenya more than any other person could have done. He has put me in charge of this ministry to assist him in creating, portraying, protecting a favorable image of Kenya outside Kenya. I've done this with great joy because the real task is being done by the President himself. After he has cleared the air around the world for Kenya, I just go around to see if there's any doubt I see.
Does that look like the demeanor of a man who has just been sacked and banished by his president? The so-called Washington trip theory behind the motive for Ouko's murder has no basis in reality, and the evidence against it is overwhelming. There was no meeting between Ouko and Bush during the prayer breakfast visit to Washington. There's no evidence at all that President Moi was cold-shouldered. By all accounts, the trip went well. Ouko's performance was praised, and he traveled back to Nairobi with his president. On his arrival in Kenya, Ouko was not sacked or banished. He was still very much the Minister of Foreign Affairs. But Troon came up with a second theory. About a month into his inquiry, he was given documents that changed his investigation dramatically. They were from a Swiss-German woman, Marianne Breiner-Matten. She claimed that Dr. Ouko was murdered because he was about to reveal corruption at the highest level of Kenya's government. But was Troon's star witness truthful and honest as he believed?